Hey everyone, this is Colin Gray from the Australian Rock Show podcast and Australian Rock Show YouTube channel here. And today I'm going to do about a 15-minute video, perhaps a little bit more, talking about some Australian CDs, autographed Australian CDs from my collection. I thought someone sent an email the other day asking specifically, did I have an autograph by a certain artist? And I didn't, but it sort of got me thinking that, I've got a bunch of CDs in my collection, some are autographed, and I thought I'd go through some just to sort of show other people what I've got. You also may have some in your collection, and if you do, then feel free to share. Leave a comment in the comment section of this video of what you've got, and other people can sort of talk about that as well if you'd like. So, CDs. Now, in this era of digital streaming, I don't know, some people still buy CDs. CD sales are obviously not as big as what they once were. And certainly LP sales are back to a point. They're very expensive to buy records. But for those of us from a certain vintage, when records basically died out in the late 80s, early 90s, then you didn't have a choice because certain albums only begun to be released on CD. So like most people, I had to buy CDs if I wanted to buy that band's latest album. I certainly had more LPs than I did CDs. I had over 2,000 LPs at one time. I don't have that many now. But I did make a point of both LPs and CDs of not getting rid of anything that was autographed. And I've largely kept to that ethos, give or take a few things. So I've got a bunch here, maybe about 10, 12 CDs, all Australian. And I thought I'd share them, provide a little bit of a story behind the background of when it was autographed, maybe a little bit about the band, and then we can go through, talk about those things if you're interested. Today I'm wearing a t-shirt by Leadfinger, band from out of Wollongong. They have their roots in Australian garage rock and roll from the 1980s, bands like Proton Energy Pills, Asteroid B612, Brother Brick, of course, all that sort of lineage. They're still around today. They've just been gigging recently. Do check them out. They're a great band if you like great original guitar-fueled Australian rock and roll. Leadfinger, led by the great Stuart Leadfinger Cunningham. So first CD we're going to look at is by a band called Hell to Pay. Hell to Pay were a band from Melbourne in the late 80s. A little bit of a supergroup. And of course this band had the great Ian Rilen from X, Sardine and Rose Tattoo in the band. And of course, Spencer Jones from any number of outfits, I suppose. B Suburban would be most sort of famous, and the Johnnies, of course. Also had Tony Biggs on drums, and then later replaced by Kathy Green. So this is autographed by all the band. I think I got this autographed at a gig they did at Crow's Nest Hotel in Sydney in around 1990, 91. It's a fantastic album, Hell to Pay, Steal It, on Red Eye Records. If you don't have it, do check it out. It's a ripper, that one. Next one is by a band from the 1970s called Taste. They had a reformation a few years ago, and some of their stuff was reissued. Ken Murdoch is the band's lead singer, and he's been active for many, many years. They had Virgil Donati on drums, of course, Prodigy, and has made a career for himself in America in recent years. And Joey Menta on guitar was a bit of a prodigy. Not too dissimilar in sound to Queen, I guess, if you're wanting a sort of contemporary reference. They supported Queen on their tour of Australia, whenever that was, 76, 75, 76, I forget. They released a couple of albums, Nights of Love and Tickle Your Fancy, back in the 70s. And they were only young guys back then, early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And both albums have still stood up pretty well. This was a best of album called the Best of Taste remasters. And check out Taste on, you can Google them because I'm sure you can still pick this up somewhere as well. They did also come back with an album about 5-6 years ago of all original material, which is also worthwhile checking out. Okay, next up is this album by a Melbourne band called Girl Monstar, and the album is called Monsterio Delicio. And this is Digipack. But Girl Monstar were an all-girl band, obviously, and they formed, I think, in 87 or maybe 88, early 88, and they released a couple of independent singles and then this album. And this album contains a whole bunch of material. The band included Anne McHugh, who has gone on to a solo career based in Nashville, and Sherry Rich, although here she was called Sherry Valier. And she also has had a career in country music. She is based in Australia still, and they were a great band. And if you want to talk about Girl Monstar, you could talk to my brother, because he had a lot to do with them in terms of promotions, and I think he ran their fan club, and he will talk all day about how great Girl Monstar were. And I guess there's some terrific songs on this, produced by Jed Starr from Star World. I think you can still pick this up if you try. It's on, it's obviously not in print still, but it's available if you search for it on eBay and all those sort of places. But there's some videos from this album, Higher Than High and whatnot. But they had a little bit of success here. They supported the Buzzcocks and the Ramones. They had some stuff on Triple J, live to air sessions, all that sort of stuff. So they did have a fair amount of exposure. But unfortunately, by I think early '93, they'd kind of run their course. I think they did the first big day out in '93, and then they folded. Okay, so the next one is by Pete Wells from Rose Tattoo. I was a huge Pete Wells fan and would see him whenever he played around Sydney. Before he had a solo deal with Mushroom Records, he would gig around in a band called Heart Attack with Mick Cox from Rose Tattoo and Lucy DeSoto, Mick Strutt, who'd been a stalwart on the Sydney scene, in a band called BB Strutt, and Paul DeMarco on drums, who's still in Rose Tattoo. So this album is the Meaning of Life album that was released in 1992 and on Mushroom. And it says to Colin, good luck, Pete Wells, 1993. Was it 92? It says 93. Maybe it was 93 when I got this signed. But I do remember getting this signed at a venue in Sydney called the Manly Boat Shed one Saturday night. And I remember sitting down at the end of the gig with Pete and his partner Lucy, who was in the band, sitting at the back of the venue on milk crates, drinking beer and having a chat. And Pete was kind enough to sign that for me. Same kind of lineage, Rose Tattoo, Pete Wells, Rose Tattoo, precursor to all that sound. A lot of that great Australian sound was created by Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, and also by this man, Loyde and the Coloured Balls. So this is an album by called The Best of Ball Power, Loyde and the Coloured Balls. And I did an interview with Lobby, I think, in 1995, which was published in Vicious Kitten fanzine over a couple of sessions, and Lobby was good enough to sign this CD for me. May he rest in peace, the great Loyde. Not sure if you can see that. It is signed. I'll take my word for it. More Australian greats from the 1960s. Darryl Cotton from Zoot, Jim Keays, of course, from the Masters Apprentices, and Russell Morris. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were gigging as Cotton, Keays, and Morris. And I saw them 3 or 4 times. In fact, they released this album called Maximum Hits. And I forget where I got this signed, a venue, I think, in Wollongong. But they were gracious enough to have a chat and sign the CD for me. Sadly, of course, Darryl Cotton and Jim Keays no longer with us. Still on Australian CDs, I was a big fan of Hush, and this was a compilation CD that was originally released on vinyl. It did score a CD release, just the best of Hush, and it has been autographed by to Rick Lum, who is still around in Sydney and still gigging. Of course, Hush did the big Countdown Reformation show, whenever that was, 2005, 2006, with original lineup, including Keith Lamb, who is not active musically, but it was Rick Lum, Les Gock, who's still at it, and the original drummer was Smiley Palthorpe. So, if you're in Australia in the mid-1970s, we had, I suppose, Hush were the biggest glam band that we had. And not forsaking, I suppose, Supernaut to a point, but Hush were certainly way bigger. They had signed to a major label. So this basically says, thanks, Cole. Keep rocking, Rick Lum. Thank you, Rick. I will indeed. And I express the same sentiment back to you. Okay. It's another one signed by Pete Wells when he was in a band called Romeo Dog, which was, I guess, kind of a heavy rock project, German project, put together by Pete and a guy called Andy Anderson, who was based in Germany, who had a tribute band called, I think it was Rose Tattoo, Tattwho tribute band. Band also featured Mick O'Shea from Judge Mercy on drums, and has been playing out, I think, still with the Rose Carleo band. Very close to getting the gig in AC/DC. There's a story there. If you listen back to a couple of interviews on the Australian Rock Show podcast, I think with Mick O'Shea, we did an interview with him. He talks about that. And also Andy Keishon on bass from Judge Mercy. Now, Andy Keishon, of course, not too long after this project, ended up getting the gig touring with Shania Twain when she toured Australia. And from there, he got the gig with Billy Joel, and he still is Billy Joel's bass player. I think it's a gig he's had for many, many years. He's also on the Australian Rock Show podcast. If you look through the interviews on this YouTube channel, search for Andy Keishon or Mick O'Shea, you can listen to both those sort of interviews. So I got this signed at a gig. They did a release for this at the Lansdowne Hotel in Sydney. I forget what year it was, but it's good. Now, this is CD by a Sydney band called Rags and Riches, and the band is led by Scott Ginn. And I think, as I said recently, is that my brother and I grew up in Sydney as hard rock kids, in particularly in that early 80s period. It was a very fertile period for heavy rock. I think pre-Bon Jovi is my sort of line in the sand, when it all kind of changed and all went very kind of sanitized. I'm happy to go head to head with anyone who wants to sort of debate that. So in Australia, it was all very underground, and we had a couple of bands who led the way in terms of heavy rock. One was Heaven, and the other one was Boss, and there were a whole bunch of bands sort of underneath that. Heaven had some success, of course, in the United States, managed by Michael Banning, and Boss also had a great album called Step On in 1984. Scott Ginn was the bass player in Boss, and he went on after the Boss period to have a couple of projects. One, of course, was Rags and Riches in the late 1980s. They released a whole bunch of great original, very similar sort of to Van Halen, I guess, if you want a contemporary reference sort of sound in terms of their original material. And maybe 10 years ago, perhaps not that long, Scott got the band back together and has been writing and releasing new material, not just under the Rags and Riches name, but also under his own Scott Ginn name. He's got a band project called Maz XT, which is worthwhile checking out. And he also has a heavy rock band, which he just released a recent album as well. Name will come to me. Sorry, Scott, it will come to me. I'll come back to you. And that's also worthwhile checking out. Dirty Tricks. There you go. I remembered. So you can Google Scott Ginn, check him out on Facebook, check out Dirty Tricks or any of his projects. It's great rock and roll. Dubrovniks were a Sydney band I was a huge fan of. If you're a fan of, I guess, bands like the Hoodoo Gurus and all that sort of bands who came out from the Radio Birdman sort of school, Hitmen, Screaming Tribesmen, all that sort of ilk, Beasts of Bourbon, all the WA power pop bands, scientists, etc. You would be familiar with the Dubrovniks. The Dubrovniks are one of my favourite bands in all their incarnations, and I would see them around Sydney whenever I could. Huge fan of this album as well, called Chrome. It was their second last album before Medicine Wheel, and I had this one signed by all the band, including the great James Baker, who had been in the Scientists and the Hoodoo Gurus up until 1986. Boris Sujevic from the Scientists, Beasts of Bourbon. He's also back in the Beasts. And Glenn Armstrong, who's in the lineup at that stage. And Chris Flynn, great Chris Flynn from Brisbane band The Headstones, and huge fan of the Dubrovniks. Check out any of their stuff. Also check out an interview on the channel that we did with Boris Sujevic. He talks about the Dubrovniks, talks about Beasts of Bourbon, talks about the band's success, all that kind of stuff. Quite interesting. They had some success overseas as well. Very big in European market, Greece, all those sort of markets. It's an album by Billy Thorpe which came out in around 94, 95. The Best and the Rest of Lock Up Your Mothers. Autograph is starting to fade, which is a shame, but it does say to Colin, all the best, Billy Thorpe. One of the greats, also no longer with us. A couple more, and we'll go for this one. So this is by a Sydney band who are also no longer with us, called Black Label. Talked about Rags and Riches before, talked about Boss and talked about Heaven. Bass player for Heaven, Laurie Marlowe, was in this band called Black Label, who were fantastic heavy rock band, who were around for a number of years, playing heavy duty kind of blues-based rock and roll, I suppose, not too dissimilar to Rose Tattoo, like Lynyrd Skynyrd kind of influence. Really great original songs as well, and this album particularly is worthwhile checking out, as all of their other albums, which you still should be able to get. And it's the Blood Money album in Digipack, signed by all the band. The band, of course, featured Steve Mullery on vocals. Steve is the brother of Ted, and today is the 2nd of September, actually, when I'm recording this, and today is Ted's birthday. Happy birthday, Ted. Unfortunately, of course, no longer with us, but his music, of course, lives on. And Steve also fronts TMG, for those who would not be aware of that. Hopefully everyone is. Okay, and the last one that I found today is by a band called Kings of the Sun. Many people will remember, who I think were around maybe 84, 85, based around Queensland originally. Spent a lot of time once they moved to Sydney, playing the Sydney circuit, played with everyone, and they got picked up and signed to a major label, and they released 2 amazing albums, a debut self-titled album, and then the second one as well. Just trying to think of the title. Had Drop Your Gun and all that sort of stuff on it. And this third one, which was released on Mushroom Records, which really, unfortunately, didn't do a lot because Mushroom didn't really promote it, but it's a fantastic album called Resurrection, and it's worthwhile checking out some of the videos. Kings of the Sun, the Hode brothers, Jeff Hode and Clifford Hode, and they supported Guns N' Roses famously across Australia in 1988, but they were based in America for a long time, recorded their albums in America, and should have been. Had a lot of great songs, and you can check out them on YouTube as well. So, folks, some CDs I've got that are autographed by Australian bands. Hope you found a little bit of that interesting. If you've got some autographed CDs, please let me know what they are. Please put some information in the comment section of this video, and others can sort of share. Maybe one day we'll go to the LPs as well. We can look at what LPs I've got that are autographed, not just by Australian artists, but also internationally as well. Thank you for watching this video. Hope you're enjoying all the recent videos we've been posting on the channel. We're trying to find some rare stuff for you. And please, if there's anything you'd like to sort of see, any sort of comments, any suggestions, please hit us up, please message us. My name is Colin Gray from the Australian Rock Show podcast. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.